So obviously I'm going to be arguing against John's point that Stalin was, and should be a national hero of Russia and the former Soviet Union by arguing that his status as a mass murderer and an enactor of genocide outweighs any kind of positive results of his rule in Russia. So rather than just like trying to like pommel John to the ground, I want to kind of like go through the four articles that we covered a little bit and kind of break down some of the ways that they complicate this issue. So obviously, like the Gulag camps were an approximate like 6 to 20 million people were deported and worked to death in the cold and often starved as well, are an incontrovertible part of Stalin's legacy and kind of like the major sticking point with a lot of people who may argue that he was a good leader for Russia, or the Soviet Union. So here you can see like some of the people working. And one of the, not one of the articles was assigned, but one of the other ones I read said that the average bread ration was like 140 grams of bread for an entire family. So sometimes like 4 people could be living off of basically what is like 2 or 3 slices of bread, like we understand it, a day. So it wasn't just that these people were being worked to death or whatever, or being put aside for like the betterment of society. As often they were billed as like enemies of the state because they were either opposed to collectivization in the Eastern European states that the Soviet Union occupied, or they were just like political opponents, or sometimes they were just rounded up based on like ethnic bases. So in David Satter's argument, he claims that there was kind of a reframing of the Soviet psyche in these times that was reflected in 3 ways that were, the priority of the state. So as John mentioned, like the interest of like the greater goods, like kind of a strict utilitarianism that disregards human rights in order to kind of advance state objectives, a lack of individual moral standards, and then like a low value attached to human life that's reflected in this kind of like turning a blind eye to the atrocities of the gulags. So part of the problem with that obviously is that you can't just like completely disregard human life, and even though Satter points out that kind of like in Russia today and in the Soviet Union there was kind of a reframing of like the value attached to human life, I would argue that you can't just like disregard human rights as part of like a national psyche or anything like that, and that like local customs can't like define what morality is. In the piece by Reuters, they kind of they go over some of the reasons that people support Stalin today, which a lot of it has to do with kind of like a both like vestigial but also kind of revived sense of like a cult of the leader, which is one of the tenets of like fascism. And so obviously John showed you a lot of the propaganda that was distributed in the day, especially that which is equating or relating Stalin and Peter the Great and other famous Soviet leaders or Russian leaders over time. And that's something that Vladimir Putin has wanted to kind of like revive as part of his political agenda. So these are some more workers in the prison camps. You can see they're not like totally jazzed up. Unsurprisingly. So yeah, this is kind of like one of my points is today is that kind of like one of the popular views, which is something that almost all of these articles go over, is that in kind of these public opinion polls, there's rising support, and in fact it's become now, we looked up some more recent numbers. I think the most recent one of these articles is from like 2013, but we found a Bloomberg piece that was saying now there's like a majority of people in these polls who support kind of like the role of Stalin as a national leader. And that's kind of like shown as a growing trend. And a lot of what some of these authors talk about is that some of his staunchest supporters within Russia are people who are like our age, like under 25, people who have never lived under Soviet rule. And so, you know, part of the problem with that is that they've never really experienced any, you know, in the least direct way they've, you know, experienced the results of Stalin's rule compared to other people who can still remember what it was like to live with his rule. The other thing is that this nostalgia is partially fueled by kind of like a survivor bias, right? Because the, in most cases at least, the descendants or, you know, people who are sent to these camps and killed or whatever don't have people who are kind of like propagating their legacy and their point of view on Stalin. You know, it's the people who made it through, who kind of, you know, reproduced and maybe more like nostalgic. And that's something that Rocklin, who wrote an op-ed that's talking about this kind of like debate over Stalin as a mass murderer, national hero, which I guess is where the title for this came from. He kind of complicates that because he is a survivor of the people who were persecuted. His family was part of, they were residents of Lithuania who were deported in probably what one of the major mass deportations were in July of 1941, which is right before the Soviets came into Lithuania. And of course, you can tell by his name probably that he's Jewish, so it was interesting because he was kind of pointing out the fact that, you know, like this deportation was horrible, but like in some way he could thank Stalin for it, because if he had been stayed in Lithuania, his family would have been exterminated by the Nazis. So it's kind of like a more complicated thing, but obviously like that wasn't enough to like make him pro-Stalin. And he kind of points out that Putin's KGB background has kind of like helped him frame the narrative and this kind of like Russia versus the world attitude, and kind of like the return to that political narrative is what has, you know, sometimes fueled this nostalgia. And then the other thing I would say that Stalin's kind of like successes in wartime, first of all, came at an enormous human cost, right? Success in war means killing people, at least in World War II's. And at the same time, like, you know, we've talked in this class about the atrocities committed by the Red Army as they moved through, you know, not just murder, but also like rape of civilians. Yeah, and then, yeah, the only other thing is that a lot of the people who, you know, kind of engaged in collectivism and were able to benefit from it eventually, you know, did so at the cost of human lives. You know, there was less demand for food when people were being starved enough to camps in Siberia. So, and a lot of the times fear drove kind of like their obedience and love for Stalin as a cult leader. Yeah, this is